Welcome to Friday night's video in our Masters series. This is the 74th video in our Masters series and the 5th video in our Mixing Concepts. Tonight we wanted to talk about frequency field. You're probably pretty familiar with the stereo field. People talk about pannings and things like that and depth and things like that. We've talked about that some. But the frequency field is a delicate issue. This becomes a problem for a few reasons. And I'll try to make this really blunt and tell you how I normally deal with it. And I deal with it differently sometimes in different productions and why. The first thing is some people will say that this you don't want to do because you're ruining the harmonic content of the natural sound of the instruments you're working with. Some people are middle of the road on it and they'll do it some. Some people will do it a lot to try to get a really hyper clean sound. And normally this basically means what you're trying to do is you're trying to box in whatever instruments you've got into their own range in the spectrum so that you've got the low end all the way up to the high end, and anything that's getting played there that it's given a range and that's high low pass filtered into it, and it's very static. This can be one of those really debatable things because sometimes you can get away with a lot and sometimes it's very little. It's very hard to get away with anything. Like, an out front vocal, you can't fuss with it all because it's right out front of everything else. Now, when you're dealing with a kick drum and a bass drum, you have another problem, is that the bass sometimes is so close to the kick drum that it's really hard to low pass filter that kick drum to where you've only got maybe 3 or 4 harmonics remaining of it without ending up with nothing but the fundamental frequency. You know what I'm saying? And so it can make it a little bit difficult because sometimes you have to let it overlap a little bit. But you will eventually understand that I use it because in some productions because it cleans things up a lot. And sometimes I won't. I mean, sometimes I'll have a situation where I'll just let it be natural. I'm not trying to low pass and clean the low end, the mid range, the high end, and trying to keep them from convoluting each other or convoluting their waveforms or other, envelopes of sound of other instruments because I don't care. I want it to do that. It's got a real natural sound, and you start low pass filtering things out of one instrument because it's passing into the frequency range of another instrument that's higher up, that it can be detrimental. It's sometimes, but that really depends on your perspective. Me, myself, sometimes it depends on how many instruments are going on. I mean, if you've got like a 4-piece band and you start trying to low pass the heck out of a guitar to make room for a pad synth that's a little bit higher, you may run into problems because there's not that many instruments going on, and you're really likely to just carve up the guitar by low passing, filtering the heck out of its higher end harmonics and causing it to sound like crap if the pad synth isn't really taking care of any of those upper end harmonics and filling the spectrum in to where it sounds nice and full and it doesn't sound like you chopped up the guitar. Because a lot of times that if you go ahead and clean up the guitar, let's say for example, and you low pass filter out a whole lot of the upper harmonics in that guitar because the pad synth is there, that it can sound fine in certain situations. But the problem is that the track by itself, if you just solo it, it's going to probably sound terrible. But with the pad synth, it sounds good because you've low pass filtering out a whole bunch of convoluting high end frequencies that trail off the guitar that are convoluting the pad synth that's up playing an octave higher or something like that. And it's a work in progress to really be able to do that well. And sometimes having to use automation because if the guitar is moving around a lot in the spectral field and you just got a high low pass to this point, does that make sense? But the guitar is going to there, but it hits that because everything above that you've left for like the pad synth in this octave range or in this 2-octave range. And that sometimes you have to let them blend. You might have a couple instruments where that pad synth is that you're really trying to do some equalization on them, like we talked about, preserving their identity. but not, cut the crap out of them with low pass filters, trying to preserve their identity like that too much, because they are moving around in the exact same spectral range as the pad synth, and so it makes it very difficult to do that, which basically means more times than not you have to work on your equalization of both of those instruments that are right around in the same octave range and in the frequency range, so that they can preserve their identity. Certain aspects of the sound you might want to go back and accentuate or attenuate certain areas of that individual track so that it works better with the other track. But this is a great process, because the biggest thing that you run into is that, for me, the process normally works like this. I've got content in my production that goes from the low end to the high end. And an example would be like, I've got the kick drum, the bass, the guitar, I've got some pad synths, and then I've got some other synth or something going up in the really high end. And I've really contained them to 1 or 2 octaves. And I start low pass filtering out. The kick drum and the bass drum can be very difficult. But most of the time that you can get away with a low pass filter, so that it doesn't, the higher end frequencies of that instrument don't pass into the next realm, or the realm of the octaves or octave or octaves above that convolute the other instrument. It's very difficult sometimes, because I've found that it's a great idea, but in practice it can be very difficult sometimes until you get really comfortable with it. Because I'll start out, like, say, with my kick drum, and I'll go down and I'll start low passing everything out of it except for like the first 3 or 4 harmonics off the fundamental, and I'll leave it like that. Does that make sense? And then I'll bring the bass on top of it and start listening to how it sounds. A being off the work I did on that kick drum, listen to it. Can I take more of it out, or can I take less of it out, until I get to where I'm happy. I've cut out quite a bit of all the tail end stuff, because basically when you're looking at it, you're looking at, if this was a kick drum, you'd have the primary frequencies and you'd have a bunch of tailing stuff going off there. And you can sometimes, low pass filter it to even up to here, to where there's only 3 or 4 harmonics off of that kick drum. And, you've got a low pass filtered off of there. And afterwards, after you get pretty comfortable with it, you got to go back to that individual track that kick drum is on, or whatever instrument, and re-equalize it, so whatever harmonic content you did save, that you re-equalize it to sound as good as possible with the remaining harmonic content you left behind. So that can be a real pain in the butt, but you can come up with some really clean, cool sounding stuff. And then I'll go to the bass. Once I'm really happy with that, then I'll go to the bass and I'll kick off the kick drum, and I'll go to the bass, and maybe the guitar's up above it. So I'll start low passing the bass until I've cut out as much as I think I can to where it doesn't sound bad. And I might have cut it out to about here, and I'll leave that low pass filter static, and I can hear it's not interfering with the guitar at all. It's none of the trailing harmonics or anything, or if they're gone. And so they're really leaving the guitar's harmonic area and frequency range really clean and open. So there's none of this stuff muddying it up or convoluting it. And then I'll start I'll stick another equalizer after that low pass filter and start re-equalizing the bass so it sounds as good as possible with the remaining harmonic content that I've left behind. And I'll go one step at a time, from the low end to the high end. The trick is that as you go along, when you get done and you're pretty happy that you're done, and you listen to the whole mix, then you got some reevaluating normally to do, because once you've gotten to that point, once you get it all playing together in the mix, then you're going to have to go back to the low end all the way to the high end. Listen to it. Do I have to bring that low pass filter up a little bit off that kick drum? Can I tighten it up a little bit to where I've only got hardly nothing, and remaining of the harmonic content of that kick drum, but it sounds fine, and the bass sounds nice and clean because it's not convoluting the bass and its harmonics coming off there. Oh yeah, does that make sense? And reevaluate each one of them one step at a time up the spectrum range, and because together it might sound a little bit different, because once you get it done that with that bass, you've got it done like that, and now you're listening to the whole mix, that you can go ahead and let off on that low pass filter a little bit and let it open up a little bit. It's not really convoluting the guitar and muddying it up as much as you thought. Or no, you might want to tighten it up a little bit and try to cut out some more, and then evaluate the equalization you did on the bass to try to get it sounding as good as possible with the remaining harmonic content that you've left behind. I try to keep this process that simple, and I try not to ever let it get any more complicated than that. And normally, before I've done this, I've tried to sit down and go through each one of my instruments and figure out what range they are in, what area they're in, what area in the frequency realm are they going to be in, and then I'm going to let them have their home in that area. Does that make sense? And write it out, just like when we were doing this here, and doing stereo field work and putting things in their place. The same thing, write it out really well. Where things are going, where is it going in the frequency range? What's its range? Where are you going to let it live? And then figure out how you low pass it out, so it doesn't interfere and convolute the instruments above it in the spectrum. Does that make sense? And just go one step at a time. Just be real careful and keep in mind that as you cut in higher up harmonic content, this stuff might not seem necessary. By itself, it will be very detrimental. That all by itself, the instrument probably not going to sound as good. But when you've got it in a mix, that you can cut out a lot of this stuff sometimes to really clean it up so that the other instruments really stand out. So each instrument in the production stands out by itself in the production as well as possible, unless you're trying to blend like we talked about. So it's a pretty simple concept. Try to keep it that simple in your head and experiment with it. Get some mixes or something like that, or some practice mixes, and just experiment with it. Really sit down or make a simple one, a little short song, and practice doing that to see what that's doing and what you can do. You'd be surprised that it can really clean up your mixes and really help give all the instruments in the mix some really nice defined territory and identity in the mix. So I hope you have fun playing with that idea. I hope I kept it as simple as possible so that you could practice with it on yourself until you get familiar with it and understand the value of it. The problem is trying to tell you where to use it and or if you should use it, because that can be very debatable depending on who you're talking to and what type of a production you're trying to do. So you will have to evaluate that on your own. Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.